Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Homage to the Blessed One, the Worthy One, the Supremely Enlightened One. Meritorious devotees, today we are going to listen to a very special Dhamma sermon for the Vesak day. The name of the sutta is Ariyapariyesana Sutta. It is in the middle-length discourses of the Buddha. It's called Majjhima Nikaya. Now the name of the sutta is Ariyapariyesana. Arya means great, and Pariyesana means quest. So Ariyapariyesana means the quest of greatness. This is the story about the Bodhisattva going forth and becoming a Buddha. Now, he was in Savatthi, in the monastery Jetavana. It's called Jetavanarama. Now, early in the morning, the Buddha robed himself, took his bowl, and went on his alms round. Meantime, a set of bhikkhus came to meet Venerable Ananda and told Venerable Ananda this. They said, Venerable Ananda, it's been a long time since we've heard a Dhamma talk from the Buddha. And if we get the chance to listen to another Dhamma talk by the Buddha, it would be great, they said. Then Venerable Ananda told those bhikkhus, if that is the case, dear friends, can you please go to the Rammika Brahmin's monastery? There you will be able to listen to a Dhamma talk. So the Venerable Ananda is the chief attendant of the Buddha. So he knows the time, the appropriate time for a Dhamma talk, and the appropriate place. So this time around, the appropriate place was Rammika Brahmin's monastery. Then these bhikkhus said, fine, if that is the case, they said, and they went to where the Dhammika Brahmin's monastery was. So after his alms round, the Buddha, now he had his meal, and he addressed Venerable Ananda. The Buddha said, Venerable Ananda, to spend the afternoon, why don't we go to the Purvarama? Now it's called the mansion of Migara Mata. Now Migara Mata is another name for Visakha. She built this monastery and offered to the Buddha and the Sangha. The name of the monastery is Purvarama. There's another name for Purvarama. It's called Migara Matupasada. It can be called the mansion of Migara Mata. The Buddha, accompanied by Venerable Ananda, to spend the afternoon, they went to Purarama. And from the afternoon until the evening, the Buddha went into a deep meditation. So all the time from his meal up to evening, he was meditating. He got up from his meditation and came to where the Venerable Ananda was and said this, "Dear Ananda, shall we go to the eastern bathing place?" Then Venerable Ananda said, "Evam Bhante." And with the Buddha, Venerable Ananda went to this eastern place to have a bath. So both of them, the Buddha and Venerable Ananda, they had a bath, and the Buddha came out of that place and wearing his underrobe, he was just sitting over there. Now this is the time Venerable Ananda, he invited the Buddha for the Dhamma talk. Venerable Ananda said, "Bhante, this Ramika Brahmin's monastery is not that far away, it's nearby. It is a beautiful place. Bhante, it is worth seeing. So Bhante, out of compassion, could you please visit Ramika Brahmin's monastery?" Venerable Ananda said. Then in silence, the Buddha accepted. Now this is something unique to the Buddhas. They don't say, is that the case? Then let's visit. They don't say, okay, yes. Those kind of words the Buddhas do not use. If they want to accept something, they stay in silence. They show the acceptance by staying in silence. So, the Buddha visited the Ramika Brahmin's ashram, or the monastery, and at that time, a huge amount of bhikkhus were there inside the monastery, this Ramika Brahmin's monastery. They were talking about Dhamma. They were having a Dhamma talk. So the Buddha got to know that they were having a Dhamma talk, and he didn't disturb the Dhamma talk. He didn't go inside until the Dhamma talk was finished. He stayed outside until it was finished. And once it was finished, the Buddha coughed and knocked on the door. So the bhikkhus who were inside, they came up and opened the door for the Buddha. Now this is really important. Once, when someone is reading a book, a Dhamma book, or when someone is listening to Dhamma, we should not disturb him. It is the time that they have that connection with the Buddha. Because do you know why? Once the Buddha said, "Yo bhikkhave dhammam passati, so mam passati." That means if someone sees the Dhamma, he sees the Buddha, he said. So when someone is reading the Dhamma or listening to Dhamma, that is the time he he's listening, that is the time the Buddha is present. So, whenever you see a person reading a book, a Dhamma book, or listening to Dhamma, we should not act in a manner that would disturb his time. We just have to give him that time to listen to Dhamma or read that book he's reading. It is an act of merit. If we disturb his time, then we will create a bad karma. The time when we are reading, we will have disturbances. So, better to keep that in mind. When someone is reading a book or listening to Dhamma, we should not disturb him. So these bhikkhus, they came up and opened the door for the Buddha. The Buddha came in and sat on the chair that was prepared for him. And the Buddha addressed the bhikkhus. He said, "Dear bhikkhus, what were you talking about? What is the talk that was disturbed by my visit?" Now, did the Buddha disturb that talk? Can you remember the incident? He didn't disturb. He didn't even knock on the door. He just stayed outside until the Dhamma talk was over. But this is the way the Buddhas speak. He just wanted to build a conversation with the bhikkhus. Then they said, "Bhante, it was about you that we were talking. It was about you that we were talking. That is the talk that was stopped by your visit." Then Buddha said, "That is very good, bhikkhus, that is very good. People like you who have gone forth out in faith for the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, this is the type of talk that you should continue. This is the type of talk that you should have," he said. When you get together, because there are two things that you should do. First is that you should have a Dhamma talk, or you should practice Aryan silence, a noble silence. Ariyapariyesana. Noble silence is when you have second jhana. Now, attaining jhanas is extremely difficult nowadays. What we can do when it comes to practicing noble silence is that whatever meditation that we practice, we should be able to practice that without talking to the person next to us. This is important when on Poya days people get together. They should remind themselves that they're under precepts and they're following the Arahants. So Arahants practiced these 2 points. First is Dhamma talks, and second is noble silence. So nowadays we don't have jhanas, but it is possible for us to practice whatever the meditation we are practicing, be it loving kindness or repulsiveness of the body, contemplating on the elements, recollecting the qualities of the Buddha, or recollecting the qualities of the Dhamma, recollecting the qualities of Sangha. You can think of your own precepts even. So, another important point to remember, noble silence. Buddha said, "Dear Bhikkhus, there are two types of quests." Now, this is the beginning of the sutta. First one is that ignoble, quest of ignoble. Now, Buddha goes on explaining what the quest of ignoble is. Dear Bhikkhus, what is it when you say ignoble quests? Dear Bhikkhus, now there are people who are subject to birth, and being subject to birth, they search for things that are subject to birth. Now, this is the first point that you have to remember. Being subject to birth, they search for the things which are subject to birth. Second is that, this is the second point, being subject to old age, they go in search for things that are subject to old age. Third point, being subject to sickness, they go on search for things that are subject to sickness. And being subject to death, they go on search for things that are subject to death. Being subject to sorrow, they go on search for things that are subject to sorrow. Being subject to be defiled, they go on search for the things that are subject to be defiled. Now, the Buddha explains what he said earlier. The Buddha says, "Dear Bhikkhus, what does it mean when it's said subject to birth? Wives and children, they are subject to birth. Servants and workers, they are subject to birth. Goats and sheep, they are subject to birth. Pigs and cocks, they are subject to birth. Elephants, cows, horses, mares, all of them are subject to birth. Gold, silver, and money, they're subject to birth. 5 sensual pleasures, they're subject to birth. Being addicted to these things, they being subject to these things, they go on search for things that are subject to birth. Now let me explain this to you. Now, what does it mean when you say birth, giving birth to money? What we do is that we take a job, we work hard and we earn money. So when we earn money, what does it mean? That means that we have given birth to money. The nature of these things, now it is important to remember, all of these things are named using one word, that is sankhara. Now, there are 3 points, 3 aspects of understanding what sankhara is. Buddha said, upado panyayati. You can see the appearance of these things. Vayu panyayati. You can see the deterioration, it being destroyed, distorted. Vayu panyayati. Titasanya tattam panyayati. That means it is based on change. Now, let's take one of the examples that the Buddha gave here. We'll take an elephant here. Now we can see the birth of an elephant. We can see it growing, aging. That means it's changing. And one day in future, that elephant will die. So see, we saw the appearance of that elephant. We saw its existence. But that existence was based on change. Let me take another example. Now, he said, wives and children are subject to birth. Now, if we take a child, from its childhood, it moves to its teenage years, from infant to a child, and from a child to a teenager, and from a teenager to an adult, and from an adult to a very old person. Then what happens is that that person dies. So we saw the appearance, we saw a change, the existence of that change, the existence was based upon change. That's what upado panyayati, vayu panyayati, titasanya tattam panyayati means. Now, the Buddha said, dear Bhikkhus, what does it mean when it said that things are subject to old age? Wives and children, they're subject to old age. Workers and servants, they're subject to old age. Sheep and goats, they're subject to old age. Swine and cocks, they're subject to old age. Elephants, cows, horses, mares, all of them are subject to old age. Now, this sutta was delivered more than 2,500 years ago. The Buddha took the examples that were at hand at those times. But nowadays, now to understand now the things that we have now, here in the sutta he says elephants and cows, they were considered really valuable. Nowadays we have vehicles, houses, all sorts of things. So all of these things are subject to birth and they are subject to old age. Then he said the 5 sensual pleasures are subject to birth. Gold, silver and money, they are subject to birth. So people who are addicted to these things with a distorted mind, they keep on being subject to old age. They go on search for things that are subject to old age. Then as I said, now the Buddha is going to explain the third point. He said, dear Bhikkhus, what does it mean when it said being subject to sickness? Wives and children, they're subject to sickness. Servants and workers, they're subject to illness, sickness. Now, it's not just us that get sick. Our parents, our children, wives, all the relatives, all of them, the acquaintances, all of them get sick. So it is not something that we experience personally. This is there for all living beings. They're subject to sickness. Then he said, sheep and goats are subject to sickness. All of these things are subject to illness. All five sensual pleasures are subject to sickness. And being subject to sickness, they go on search for things that are subject to sickness. Then he said, dear Bhikkhus, what does it mean when it said being subject to death? Wives and children, they're subject to death. Now, our relatives, we can't live with them forever. They leave us. Sometimes we leave them. This is an important point. Once Buddha said, Ariyapariyesana Sutta. It doesn't matter if you are a woman, a man, someone who has gone forth, or a lay disciple. It doesn't matter whoever you are. Abhinam Pachiya Kitabang. Regularly, again and again, you have to think that Marana Dhammo mi Maranang Ananti Tuati. I'm a person who is subject to death, and I haven't surpassed death. So you have to think as a disciple of the Buddha. This is an important practice of Dhamma, contemplating on death. Now here Buddha said, people being subject to death, they go on search for wives and children. But the reality when it comes to wives and children is that they're subject to death as well. Workers and servants are subject to death as well. Sheep, goats, pigs, cows, elephants, cows, horses, and mares, all of these, are possessions. They're subject to death. We can't have them forever. Five sensual pleasures, he said, they're subject to death. So they're not permanent, they're impermanent. So that's why we can't keep them forever. So being addicted to these things, indulged in these things, people, even though they are subject to death, they go on search for the things that are subject to death. Now he goes on explaining the same way about sorrow. He said, dear Bhikkhus, what does it mean being subject to sorrow? Wives and children, they're subject to sorrow. They give pain, the Buddha said. They produce pain, the Buddha said. Workers and servants, they produce pain. They produce sorrow. Sheep, goats, pigs, cows, elephants, cows, and horses and mares, all of these things, they produce sorrow. 5 sensual pleasures, he said, 5 sensual pleasures produce sorrow. So being indulged in these things, addicted to these things, with a distorted mind, they stay and they go on search for these things which are subject to sorrow, that give sorrow. And the Buddha said, "Dear Bhikkhus, what does it mean when it said being subject to defilements? Wives and children are subject to be defiled. Workers and servants are subject to be defiled. Goats, sheep, pigs, cocks, elephants, cows, horses, mares, subject to be defiled. Gold, silver, money, subject to be defiled. And 5 sensual pleasures, they're subject to be defiled." Indulge in these things with a distorted mind. What people do is that being subject to being defiled, they go on things that are subject to being defiled. Now, what does it mean by being defiled? It means that our mind, the impurities that we have, our mind gets defiled. Our mind gets defiled with 3 things, that is lust, hatred, and delusion. Not just these things, but jealousy is there. And when it comes to hatred, we can understand when a person gets angry, the way he behaves. From the way he behaves, we can see that his mind has been defiled. So the Buddha said, being subject to these things, people go on search for things that are subject to these things. And this is, he said, this is the thing that is called the quest of ignoble. The quest of ignoble things. So we have come to the end of the first part of this Dhamma sermon. You will be able to listen to the second part of this Dhamma sermon in our next session. So from the merit we gain today by listening to this Dhamma sermon, we wish you would attain the supreme bliss of Nibbāna in this Gautam Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.